The Hindutva right was a fringe force for decades, but has been on the ascendant in India in the last 25 years, and now it is in power. How did it get here? And what are its dominant characteristics? Christophe Jaffrelot, a professor of political science at Sciences Po in France, has been keenly studying India and especially the Hindutva right for over 30 years. Jaffrelot, who has also taught at King's College London, Columbia University, and Yale, has written several books on Indian nationalism, caste politics, and Indian nationalism. His latest work is India's First Dictatorship on the Emergency, written with Pratinav Anil and published by HarperCollins and released earlier this month. Professor Jaffrelot, welcome to The Wire.
Thank you, Sidharth. Thank you.
Your latest book is on the emergency of 1975 and is called India's First Dictatorship. Very provocative name, by the way. It was a time when fundamental rights were suppressed and many dissidents, including political leaders, were thrown into jail. Many commentators today call the present conditions in India as an undeclared emergency. Would you agree, or how would you see it?
Well, I would say that there are some common features and some clear differences. And I would begin with the differences. The emergency resulted in the arrest of about 100,000 people, if you add up everybody. It resulted in mass sterilization of probably more than 10 million people, and many other dramatic features, including, of course, the rehabilitation, quote unquote, of slum dwellers, including those of Delhi under the aegis of Jagmohan, and so on and so forth. Well, it was in a very short span of time, 21 months only, a somewhat cataclysmic, you can say, political and social development. This is not what we are seeing today after 6 or even 7 years. I'll return to that. Secondly, Mrs. Gandhi decided the emergency without any preconceived plan. It was somewhat improvised. Certainly, the idea of the emergency was in the pipeline since January 75. But if there had not been the Allahabad High Court judgment, if the Gujarat elections had not been lost by Congress, she might have not decided the emergency. So it was not that pre-planned. And last but not least, there was no ideology behind, really. And in fact, in the book, we emphasize this dimension. She had a leftist discourse. She introduced the word socialism in the preamble of the Constitution and the word secular, but that did not give the emergency an ideology. And in fact, she pleased the big industrial families, industrial houses, more than the workers. Strikes were banned, bonuses were abolished, and in fact, the great beneficiaries were not the workers at all. So the idea that it was a dictatorship of the left is certainly wrong. It had no ideology. It was what we call a sultanist moment, a moment of personal dictatorship. That said, you can certainly see affinities and compare different features of the two moments. One, the formidable personalization and concentration of power in the hands of one man and woman, and probably two persons on both sides. In that sense, the emergency is not an aberration. It is the culminating point of an evolution of Congress since the 1969 split. Gradually, Mrs. Gandhi concentrated power in her hands. And with the help of Sanjay, she replaced old-timers, Congress veterans by sycophants. And sycophancy is one of the reasons why you could see the Congress becoming so disinstitutionalized. And therefore, that made the emergency possible, in fact. There was nobody to resist her. Well, very similarly, we've seen the BJP changing dramatically from a party that was known for its collegiality, a party that was known for its organization, cadre-based organization, being transformed into a much more centralized party apparatus. And again, you have two persons at the helm. Of course, Narendra Modi, but clearly also Amit Shah was being party president. So that's the concentration of power effect that is very similar. And that goes with another dimension that you can compare. And that's why you can apply the concept of sultanism to both. And by the way, this is a Weberian concept. Max Weber was the first one to define sultanism on the basis of discretion. When you can almost freely decide, when one man can almost freely decide how the state should be run, you enter in the sultanist moment. And that's something Juan Linz, another very perceptive political scientist, said about many regimes across the world in the 70s and 80s. So this is something different from only concentrating power in your hand. It's what you do with this power. And most of the time, it's this discretionary power resulted in the making of cronies, in the making of a clique, in the making of, you can say, a small group of people who will benefit in a rather nepotistic way. So you create oligarchs or you cultivate oligarchs. Never forget that under Indira Gandhi's emergency and slightly before and even more clearly after, we saw the making of Reliance and the making of the man who was behind Reliance. The last thing I want to say in terms of comparison, the emergency was made possible because many institutions preferred safety to opposition. And many people in these institutions do not exist irrespective of the people. For instance, the judiciary. You look at what the Supreme Court of India became during the emergency, and you realize that, except on a couple of occasions, the judiciary bowed to the executive power instead of resisting. The most telling case of this is, of course, the habeas corpus case. If Justice Khanna had not saved the honor of the Supreme Court at that time, nobody would have. Well, similarly, we see today a Supreme Court that is not opposing the executive anymore at any cost. That is not even taking up cases. You wait for months, years, before seeing something like the abolition of Article 370 even considered. And the list of these cases is very long. That works for the judiciary, that works for the media to some extent. Who resisted the emergency among the newspapers? A handful of them. Indian Express, Statesman, The others preferred to play it safe. And we quote in the book a very interesting citation by Kuldeep Nair. Kuldeep was absolutely taken aback by the way his colleagues behaved. He anticipated resistance, he anticipated courage, and he was very surprised. He would be equally surprised today. So the parallels are, in that sense, very interesting. For us, in the book, we come to this conclusion that it's revealing of the shallowness of democratic culture to some extent. To some extent, there is no appetite for freedom, and the fighters were very few. Those who resisted were very few. And there again, you can definitely make some parallel.
So, Christophe, the BJP and RSS leaders were in jail during the emergency, many of them. We understand that even Mr. Modi was either in jail or had escaped. And of course, Mr. Vajpayee and others were. And so also Balasaheb Devara was chief of RSS at the time. But now it looks like they have borrowed heavily from her in some ways, except for the critical differences that you have pointed out. And one of them is, of course, that there was a law enacted, so-called, at midnight. But and that hasn't happened. But many critical differences are there. But some of the ideas in terms of the larger-than-life like imagery, the populism, etc., they may not have been directly taken from her, but they certainly reference her in some ways. So it's ironical that after that experience and after many years of insisting that the BJP was going to be very, very democratic, and for periods it was, we come to this pass so many years later. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, no, it's definitely ironical when you remember, indeed, the fact that Jan Sangis joined hands with socialists, with Congress O people for saving democracy, and saving democracy in the framework of the JP movement in the first place. And then, of course, in the building of Janata Party. At the same time, it's very interesting to see that this amalgamation of forces was made of people who were following different agendas. And when you read, for instance, D.P. Tangari, who was one of the most influential RSS leaders who had started the Bhatia Mazdoor song and so on, he clearly said that this battle is not for democracy the way it was before, because democracy the way it was before was imported from the West, and it will have to be transformed. So it was very clear that in the short run, yes, everybody had to coalesce and dislodge Mrs. Gandhi from power, but in the longer term, agendas would definitely diverge. And they diverged very quickly indeed, because if the Janata Party imploded, it was precisely because in terms of policies, there was no way all of these people could sit together. You know, when you look at the way ex-Jan Sangis pushed issues such as anti-conversion bill, the rewriting of history textbooks, the promotion of cow protection, you know, that's something the socialists could not consider as priorities. And on the contrary, they were at the loggerheads so far as reservations were concerned, land reform were concerned. So yes, they fought together for an immediate goal, but they were not supposed to work together for the same democracy in the mid-range and longer term. Yeah.
So You've been seeing the Hindu right wing closely for nearly 30 years. And, in 1984, they got 2 seats in parliament. They were very, very demoralized. You've written extensively about the Sangh Parivar. From what you just said, it is clear that they have always had their agenda, but they were weak and now they're in power. So, has it grown, morphed, changed? Where do you see it today compared to what it was then? And how did this journey happen? Despite the fact that even Mr. Modi is following the same agenda as they did, but fundamental things about the BJP compared to the Jan Sangh had changed.
Yeah. What is fascinating is to see that since 1925, when RSS was created, the core ideology remained the same. There are very few movements in the world which do not change fundamentally over 1 century, and not only do not change, but prosper, because you can shrink, you can remain true to your ideology, but that is the reason why you become redundant and irrelevant. In their case, they have remained true to their ideology and they have grown. I think it's unique, really, in the history of the world, such an organization, such a movement. Now, of course, that is also because they have adapted, not the core ideology that has remained the same, but the modus operandi. And for me, there is there are 2 big transformations. One is the diversification of, you can say, subsidiaries, offshoots. They started with a student union, ABVP in 48, then a labor union, BMS in 55, then VHP in 64. In between, you had the Vanavasi Karanashram in the 50s. It diversified constantly. You have to add Sarasvati Shishu Mandir, 77, Seva Bharti, 79. There is no area of society, there is no place, there is no sector of society that is not penetrated. Bharatiya Kisan, Sangh, BKS. And there is not one profession. The lawyers, the ex-army men, name one. You have an organization that is in a position to infiltrate, in a way, penetrate.
Certainly the media, I can tell you.
And of course, that's more, well, you have 2 kinds of diversification. You have the official one and you have the unofficial one. So it can be unofficial in some professions, and the list is even longer, probably, if we go in that direction. But then you have another transformation that is, of course, much more obvious in politics. And that's what Narendra Modi has achieved. For decades, the Sangh Parivar was an upper-caste elite. You can say even Banya Brahmin organization. Really, Jan Sangh could never cross the glass ceiling of 10% of the valid votes because it was confined to this world, to this universe. They could do more in the 90s because of allies. And for Atal Bihari Vajpayee and L.K. Advani, there was no way out of coalition politics. They considered, and Advani considered till 2014 that coalition politics was the only way to make progress, and you can attribute the progress they could make in the 90s largely to coalition politics. And that did not last. 2004, 2009, they were back almost to what they were before. So the real turning point is 2014. And this turning point, when BJP crosses the 30% valid vote mark, is due to a transformation that has been achieved by Narendra Modi, who gave BJP, you can say, a plebeian dimension. And this plebeian dimension was partly due to his own pedigree, to his own background, and he could project himself as a Chaivala, as a backward caste person, and that could work to some extent. But of course, it's more than that. It's more than his personal biography. It is his style of politics. It's a populist style of politics. BJP was not a populist party. It was an ethno-nationalist party that was an upper caste, middle class, urban party. And Modi's style of politics transformed that. And it transformed that because of the way Modi spoke to the people, the kind of discourse, even the way he pronounced words, the intonation itself matters. It's a performance. And he spoke like most of the populist leaders, really. In that sense, you can compare the performances of Modi, Bolsonaro, Trump, Orban. They have much in common. They speak against the establishment. They speak against those who are English-speaking people, who therefore are seen as part of the elite. They are against the Lutyens intellectuals, which means the can market gang, which means the establishment. That's the populist repertoire. And I am your voice. Donald Trump used to say, I am your voice. I am your voice against the establishment of both the East and the West Coast. Well, Modi was the voice of those who felt discriminated against, who felt left out. And that worked. And I think it worked in a very specific moment, the post-Mandal moment, because OBCs, low caste, you can say plebeians, had started to emancipate themselves. And that was because of Mandal. And they had started to assert themselves. But of course, they had reached a plateau because it's very difficult from there to join the middle class. There's a gap, a big gap. And the middle class was, in any case, already behind BJP. And he could amalgamate to this core base the frustrated OBCs, whom he had rechristened the neo-middle class. Remember, 2012, for the first time, Narendra Modi says, there is a group of aspiring people, they are coming up, they come from the village, but they are urbanized, they come from the OBCs, but they don't want to be in caste politics. That's the core group that he amalgamated to the middle class basis that BJP already had, and that results in the 30% of votes that he got in 2014. So this, for me, is new. It gives BJP a new dimension. Of course, the big question, and I close on that, what does the BJP do after Modi? Because when a party that used to be a cadre-based party relies so much on a personality, it has to reinvent itself again. It has been transformed. It will have to transform itself again. And in 10, 15 years from now, this question may be even more acute. So that's why parties are like living organisms, in a way, living or dying organisms, because we've seen parties which have died, that have died also.
So at the same time, it was a kind of perfect moment, partly engineered, partly natural, that you had a situation where he was emerging with the full backing of the business class, middle class, etc. He repositioned himself. In retrospect, I think even the repositioning was not really that crucial, because I think his core audiences were in any case beginning to coalesce around him. But at the same time, the Congress was very weak. The strategies like the Anna Hazare agitation, which now we know was also similar to the JP one, where the RSS took a big part, the media allegations against UPA, corruption, which have not really been proved, that also came at the same time. Now, you can say that this was orchestrated, but you can say he was the man of the moment, and the moment was created for him.
Yeah. No, certainly. Circumstances always play a big role in this kind of, I would say, transformation, really huge transformation of the political landscape. You know, when you compare India today and India 7 years ago, you just can't recognize the political landscape. So that cannot be the work of one man only, certainly. You have structural forces which are at work. One of them, I've just mentioned it, was the emancipation of plebeians looking for another step to move forward. And I really think that Hindu nationalism was this new identity for many beneficiaries of Mandal caste politics, who were now frustrated and were looking for self-esteem. And he was very good at giving them self-esteem as the defenders of the Hindu community. Another structural transformation was the disillusion with democracy. Now, it's very interesting to look at surveys, especially the CSDS surveys, State of Democracy in South Asia, that these are very comprehensive surveys. And you have others, you know, the Pew Center surveys are equally interesting, and they show one thing. The lack of attachment to democracy, to the least, was increasing in India steadily. It's not only in India, all over the world, democracy does not deliver sufficiently for the people anymore. But in India, it was particularly pronounced. And what was interesting was that there was a kind of demand for a strong man. So you can say it's structural, you can say it's conjectural. Of course, it's partly conjectural. Manmohan Singh was the anti-hero, you know. He was certainly not a strong man. He was many things. He was probably the best manager of coalitions plus democratic and economic reforms that India could get, you know, from RTI to NRGA, but he was not a strong man. So there was a demand for a strong man, and there was no supply. On the supply side, there was a clear scarcity, and Congress did not have the leader who could have cashed in on this demand that was emerging. So yes, you can say that it's partly a man-made rise to power. It's partly something that was latent and that crystallized at that moment. And I would really combine both factors. Because as you said, the anti-corruption movement of 2011, 2012, 2013 was largely man-made. So there was a latent demand, but it was precipitated.
So Narendra Modi's rise, correspondence, you mentioned other countries. It corresponded with the emergence of populist and somewhat authoritarian figures, perhaps even in many ways anti-democratic, in different parts of the world, the US, Brazil, Hungary, Philippines, and of course, Trump. Is that history sometimes follows rhythms and patterns, but is that, or is there some giant kind of scheme, or is it just an amazing coincidence?
No, again, I think we have both. We have somewhat man-made factors and also structural factors. Yes, man-made factors because these people benefit from professional communication. We have PR companies working on marketing the strongman across the globe. Now, there is one company that worked for Narendra Modi, APCO worldwide, that has many customers across the globe. So they can sell the kit for getting the right words at the right time for the right people. So that's one. Another man-made factor is these leaders, you could add Netanyahu, by the way, are also very close to each other and they help each other. You know, when Donald Trump invites Modi in Houston, Modi invites Trump in Ahmedabad, and this kind of international exposure helps. Wow, my leader is an international leader, recognized worldwide. Yes, recognized by his peers. That's where it is man-made. You know, this is a kind of construction. But yes, you're right. It's also something you can consider as a structural change. They are waves. They are Zeitgeist, as we say in German. It's interesting to see that the first populist moment in the 70s had not only Indira Gandhi, but also Mrs. Bandaranaike, but also Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, but also Juan Perón being back in 73 in Argentina. No, this is the moment, you can call it the leftist populist moment of the 70s. And then it recedes. And then we have a wave of neoliberalism and democracy. You know, this is what we've seen in the third wave of democratization of the 90s. And since the 90s, democracy is receding and populism / authoritarianism is on the rise. There is a cycle. There are cycles in political history. So probably this one will also end one day. The defeat of Donald Trump in that sense, retrospectively, may be seen by historians as the turning point, but it's too early to say.
So in India, you mentioned populism. In India, words like fascism, authoritarianism are freely used. Populism is, of course, a description of what people do, but it does not fully explain what it is, also in theoretical terms. Should we be more careful in describing what is happening? After all, in many ways, we are still a functioning democracy. There are voices being raised. The South is not fully charmed yet. We don't know what's going to happen in West Bengal. So are there new words to be coined, or some of those words are applicable, or is it just a particularly Indian or local type of authoritarianism, America, Brazilian, Russian, and now in India, which is the Hindu kind of authoritarianism?
Well, as political scientists, we try always to be the more precise. I mean, social scientists at large have to be very careful with the words they use. And it's certainly difficult to apply words out of their context. So fascism is something that has crystallized in the interwar period in Europe, and that has certainly been replicated elsewhere, but always with variations. And populism similarly needs to be adapted. I really, in the particular case of India today, prefer the word national populism, because national populism captures the fact that the style is populist. The leader projects himself as the defender of the people against the establishment, as the voice of the people. It keeps mentioning the poor all the time. And at the same time, the policies which are implemented are pro-rich and at least neutral in terms of social redistribution. The populist is not a socialist, never. So the style is there, but the ideology is also there, and it's nationalism. It's an ethno-religious brand of nationalism. So it explains why national populism has so many affinities with rightist ideologies. And it's very important to keep these two words together, because many political scientists will consider that populism is only a style, and it can be on the left or on the right. Nationalism is an ideology, and when it is for defending the majority of the sons of the soil only, it's an ethnic nationalism. So for me, this is what captures the more clearly the present moment in India. But that said, this has affinities with authoritarianism, and it has natural affinities. First of all, the concentration of power in the hands of the populist leader makes him almost naturally authoritarian when he conquers power. You know, he has been elected as the hero of the political game. The MPs have been elected because of him. So when you have power after this kind of election campaign, inevitably, you concentrate power even more than your predecessor. And secondly, when you are a national populist, you transform democracy into an ethnic democracy. The minorities are bound to become second-class citizens because you have been elected not by them, but by the sons of the soil. So the kind of political regime that you get after a national populist election has some affinities with authoritarianism. And of course, it can result in what I mentioned already, sultanism. The sultanist movement or moment is when not only power, but economic power are also concentrated in the hands of one man or one group of persons. And in fact, sultanism, according to Ranlins, has also one feature that needs to be mentioned: privatization of violence, the use of vigilante groups for disciplining the opposition and the minorities. That's one feature that goes very well with the authoritarian moment that we are seeing today.
One of the interesting things is that while the BJP has won at the center twice, and the second time even with a better margin, it does very poorly. Excuse me, I'm going to repeat that. So one of the interesting things, Christophe, is that while the BJP has won the center twice, and the second time you saw they had a better majority, better percentages, it does very poorly in the states. Now, India is obviously a federal republic. It has won only 2 states in recent years on its own. The rest are with coalition partners, and in 1 or 2 cases, the coalition partners have actually more numbers. This is a contradiction. I understand that local elections are fought on local issues, but still, it should be more or less in congruence. Some places not so easy, but Maharashtra is a very good example.
Yeah, no, that's precisely a reflection of the transformation of BJP. During the Vajpayee-Advani years, not only the party was more collegial, but it was open to coalitions. It was, in fact, pro-coalition politics. And under Narendra Modi and Amit Shah, clearly the idea was to cash in on the image and popularity of Narendra Modi at the expense of the party apparatus. Now, in many states, the BJP does not even project a chief minister in waiting. No, that was just inconceivable 10 years ago. And when they conquer a new state, they make a point to use or to parachute, you can say, weak chief ministers, which is, by the way, exactly what Mrs. Gandhi did in the 60s and 70s. So I would say the result of this strategy is precisely what you describe. The party relies on the popularity of one man who wins elections at the center because he is the candidate at the center. But the party has lost its dynamism at the state level, partly because it has lost its leaders at the state level. And this disconnect will certainly be complicated for two reasons. One, how federal can the country be if most of the energy is in the center? You know, there is a centralization effect. And so many BJP chief ministers keep referring to Delhi, keep reporting to Delhi before deciding anything. You know, this is not the kind of federalism we used to have when Bairon Singh Shekhawat was chief minister of Rajasthan, when Kalyan Singh was chief minister of Uttar Pradesh. That was very different. And secondly, of course, the other question is, what about the way the center will deal with the non-BJP states? Because the crisis of federalism is you know, on both sides. Hyper-centralization when the BJP rule states keep referring to the center and are creators of the center, and opposition, very, very, you can say, deep opposition between non-BJP states and the center. Recently, the Maharashtra chief minister said, you know, India could explode or implode the way USSR imploded. Who could have said that only 10 years ago? This is a reflection of an animosity, a degree of animosity that you could find only when you look at what India was indeed under Mrs. Gandhi, when you add this kind of antagonism. But this is not, you can say, cooperative federalism or federalism at all. So this is one of the big challenges for the Indian Union, to make sure that the states and the center work together and maintain a very constructive agenda, which is even more necessary given the economic crisis that is devastating society at the moment.
So apart from this, the centralization of power in Delhi, and within that, the centralization of power between two people who are pushing together their agenda, though of course they are meeting resistance in a few places. CAA was one, the farm protests are another. Apart from that, do you not think that there are inherently weak spots in the Hindutva idea, which make it very, very difficult for it to stay the course? They keep getting stronger, and they have managed to capture what one would call the otherwise undecided option. But now they can't seem to have answers for the economic problems. And yes, the Congress is weak, but people are losing jobs, salaries are being cut, companies are, did very, very poorly in the last 2 or 3 years. And now the farmers this. So isn't that got some inherently weaknesses where you say that I'm going to drive Hindutva to the cost of anything else? My point is, a Hindutva-oriented party or a one-mission-oriented party, Hindu Rashtra Party, which also does badly or is inefficient at managing the country. So isn't that a solid weakness?
No, it is. It is, definitely. agenda is so heavily loaded in terms of ideology that it is at the expense of the management of the economy and at the expense of pragmatism to some extent. Because a pragmatic ruler would, for instance, diffuse tensions with farmers instead of being so adamant. So this is certainly a weakness. Another one that is equally important is the way such a regime lets inequalities increase and even sometimes exploit inequalities and therefore let them grow. But that's definitely self-defeating. And inequalities in India are increasing. One day we'll get the official statistics, but we know that the last NSS, the National Sample Survey results, we are showing that mass poverty was increasing again, which is really, that was before the COVID crisis. So that's another, of course, limitation. The concentration of power and economic power in few hands at the expense of the masses everywhere in the world has resulted in resistance. Now, it doesn't mean that the leader can lose power that easily. First of all, because he controls the means of communication, he controls the narrative, he somewhat controls the opposition to some extent, and he has the image, as I said, of the savior beyond accountability. So that can go on, and this is precisely the problem. That can go on for such a long time that you reach a point of no return. It's very difficult to recover. If it lasts 10, 15, 20 years, we've seen other countries going in this direction, and then either they become client states, they are bailed out by a big country that can use them against another country. That could very well happen the way it happened to Pakistan. Pakistan was bailed out by the US and became the main ally in South Asia for containing USSR in Afghanistan, and then, of course, Islamism in Afghanistan again. So that's the fate of, you can say, client states. They may be nuclear, they may be big countries. They can't run their own business by themselves because they have reached that point, that is a point of no return. Or you have the alternative, that is social movements. Politicians can't do the job, no institution can do the job, nobody resists. So the people have to do it by themselves. And that's why civil society organizations are also targeted, but they may be, at the end of the day, the only modus operandi for containing power. In between these two scenarios, there are many others. And it's very difficult to anticipate what is the course of history in such circumstances.
Yeah, but just to wind up, speaking of social movements, the CAA was certainly one, though it was targeted at one particular subject, but it caught the imagination of a lot of people who wouldn't have been affected by the act.
Sure.
And it was easy to demonize, but despite the provocations, it did not falter till COVID came along and the lockdown. This particular one looks like it is for a particular very, very specific farm laws, and it is a specific reason and a specific group of people, farmers. But essentially, I see it as a fight for identity, because certainly in Punjab and UP, the attachment to the land, to the village, is across the board, to whether somebody is in Canada or somebody is a chief executive. So I think that attachment to the land also cuts across the rest of the country. And it could be that. we should not get too hopeful or too optimistic on that front, or oversee, get carried away by seeing too much in it. But stranger things have happened, and so I personally feel that it's a very dynamic situation. By no means one can say. I mean, I want to know, as a concluding remarks, whether you see it as still a dynamic situation or that the matter has been settled. And
no, it is indeed a dynamic situation for the reasons you've just mentioned. This is civil society that is every year, under one form or the other, acting, reacting. Never forget the students who were also very active originally. So things indeed may happen. One variable for me remains very difficult to interpret is, what will the rest of the world say? Because, there is a limit to repression when you're watched. And how watchful are the international organizations, foreign governments? The Western countries so far, and that was largely because of Trump, considered that India had to be the balancing power vis-a-vis China. And for that reason, no interference with internal affairs were allowed. That will remain, and the Indo-Pacific narrative is nothing else but a way to look at powers, local powers, regional powers for containing China. That's largely the subtext of Indo-Pacific. But to what extent can this result in no interference with India's domestic affairs? For me, this is the big question mark vis-a-vis the Biden administration. And we'll see very soon how far he will go in speaking, and with Kamala Harris as vice president, speaking for or against or neutrally to Indian leaders. Because if there is a sense of loss of international credibility and image because of repression, because of the way the regime is behaving vis-a-vis protests, civil society based protest, then that may change the whole equation. And that's why we have to scrutinize the words that Joe Biden will be using in the coming weeks and months. There'll be many occasions for interactions.
Certainly, we saw a little bit about the shutdown of the internet, which was a specific non-governmental statements by pop stars, etc., etc. Some politicians have also said it because they chose a subject which was nothing to do with a so-called internal matter, because there's no such thing as an internal matter anymore. But they chose something that touches every youngster in the world, and those people are a mass. They get really involved, and they go on Google and check what is this internet shutdown.
True.
And so
that's my next op-ed. That's my next op-ed, Sidharth.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Professor Christophe Jaffrelot. Wonderful as ever. And you put a lot of things into perspective. It's, of course, as we said, an unending subject for all of us.
Yeah.
And, we look forward to what else you have to say and write about. Thank you very much for joining.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.